Thank you very much. Howdy. I really appreciate the invitation to speak today at Vanderbilt and to have received the invitation from the Religion and Economy Faculty Working Group out of the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture. I've known Doug Meeks now for 15 years and am highly indebted to him for, like the highly indebted countries, I'm a highly indebted person for his work on God the Economist and putting systematic theology and political economy together in critical conversation. And I know James Foster through his work on inequality and our mutual admiration for and work with Amartya Sen. And I really appreciate the opportunity to interact with him as well. And Katie Atanasi, who was my student, I guess, in a class at Harvard Divinity School a few years ago when I was visiting up there to teach a couple courses. So I feel like I'm among friends, and I look forward to sharing my ideas with you. I look forward to engaging in this academic discussion about some real hard, practical issues of human suffering and lack of agency in the world. And so I don't want to lose sight of that even as we get into this rarefied air you talked about. I do hope you'll find the ideas interesting and look forward to the question and answer and comment and discussion after. So let me jump into this paper that looks at inequality and the agency of the poor and the powerful and how it might affect our thinking about addressing poverty in the world today. So how ought we as people of goodwill live in a global economy in which the stakes are so high and the system so complicated? How can we act faithfully and effectively when it is clear that most economic forces are beyond our control? Even when we desire to fight poverty, how do we know what we should do? Do we as affluent persons by any global standard, and that includes all of us, of course, today, if you made it to this classroom, how do we have any power to make a difference vis-a-vis global poverty? The larger and more complex the economy gets, the harder it is for us to think carefully about economic life, its problems, and its opportunities. Our traditional Christian moral norms about economic life presupposed face-to-face economic interaction. Commutative justice involved fairness in the person-to-person exchange of goods. Distributive justice involved very tangible laws about aiding impoverished persons within one's own community. Even when the Apostle Paul spoke about aiding other Christian communities, he was able to speak in detail with some familiarity or some visiting correspondence with those persons. Traditional Christian morality in economic life was based then on interpersonal relations among neighbors, but our contemporary global economy is based upon impersonal exchanges for the most part around the world. Not only is it difficult for us then to know about how to think about the economy, its opportunities and its problems, it's also challenging for us to believe that we have any significant agency to shape that economy. Figures like 2.6 billion persons earning less than $2 a day, or almost 1 billion earning less than $1 a day, those we say are in extreme poverty. These figures are staggering. What can we do about them? And we as educated Americans, we're the ones who are supposed to have power and influence in the world. Agency is a vital term for understanding the plight of poor persons, of course, also, and their own prospects to escape destitution. Sustained positive progress against severe poverty and towards development requires an increased agency of the poor themselves, and notably, especially the agency of poor women. The level or degree of global inequality is as severe as inequality in the most unequal nations of the world today. Such disparity creates problems of agency for both poor and the powerful. I'm reminded of a Far Side cartoon. It's been a long time since I saw it, but it's got two frames, two people who have just been on a date. And I know it's gendered, but I can't remember which way the gendered problem runs, so I'm okay to talk about it. The one person says, does that person like me? Did I say the right things? Did I wear the right things? Was it a good conversation? And the second the frame has the other person lying in bed after the date saying, you know, I think I really like vanilla. The idea, the caption was, same planet, different worlds. Now we're talking about something much more serious today. But the question is, do we really live in the same world? Do we experience the same world? We as global affluent persons experience the same world as the global poor. So moral discussions in this approach, these discussions about inequality often center around questions like, are the rich and poor actually alike? Or are we so separated from one another that for all intents and purposes our respective experiences as human beings are incommensurable or nonsensical to each other? So that's an important perspective, and I think we should talk about that. But today, in this paper, I'd like to suggest that the scope of the global economy and its current level of inequality make the reality of the poor and the powerful similar, if not identical, in at least this sense. All of us experience a diminished sense of agency for addressing global problems, including poverty, even if we agree that they need solving. It bears repeating that I do not suggest in any way that the burdens of poverty are equally shared by rich and poor. I hope that's clear. And the agency of poor and rich are each stunted by a global and unequal world, but the agency of the powerful certainly is higher than the agency of the poor. I hope that's also clear. But talking about the agency frustrations of both rich and poor, and everyone in between for that matter, can add an additional dimension to our conversations about both global inequality and poverty, and that's why I'm focusing on them today. Seen in one way, let me give you an overview of the paper. Seen in one way, I'm going to be talking about an eclectic group today, a Nobel Prize winner, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and a Grammy Award winner. Now let me give you a little more specifics on how I will proceed. I'll first explore the concept of agency as it relates to living in poverty, and I'll draw in particular from both Christian social ethics and the capability approach of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. Next, I will consider efforts to bridge this agency problem between the rich and the poor, including one proposal by the political scientist and leadership scholar James McGregor Burns. And then I'll consider one effort from the side of the powerful nations and citizens in those countries to alleviate poverty. And on this, I will examine the celebrity leadership of Bono, perhaps more popular than Amartya Sen and James McGregor Burns combined, in terms of his own agency and the agency of his followers who have joined the One campaign against global poverty and related efforts. And interestingly, Bono draws deeply on Christian images in his own works, in his songs, in his talks, as a source of his own agency and as a source to motivate others to act. Then I'll conclude with some reflections on why we should talk about agency and what this all means for moving ahead as an important part of our anti-poverty agenda. So first, agency and poverty. What is agency? It can be defined in this discussion as a person's capacity to achieve within his or her social context those things that he or she values. One's own well-being is an important end that a person can seek to achieve, but people can also have agency to pursue other ends, like the well-being of loved ones or strangers. The agency freedom is, quote, what the person is free to do and achieve in pursuit of whatever goals or values he or she regards as important, according to Amartya Sen. And agency achievement is the actual attainment of those ends that we desire. Amartya Sen contrasts the concepts of the agent and the patient. An agent is someone who acts and brings about change for himself or herself, while the patient is merely acted upon, even if that action is for the patient's benefit. Now, throughout his own corpus, Sen emphasizes the value of agency, particularly for poor women and men, on intrinsic grounds, as well as for its instrumental benefits for contributing to other vital outcomes or functionings. Indeed, along with the intrinsic value of agency, this literature has emphasized that women's increased agency contributes to increases in the well-being of others, especially their children. So what am I saying here about agency and well-being? Agency is both bigger and smaller than well-being. Agency is bigger than our own well-being in the sense that we might have agency to affect the well-being of others or to pursue other goals. For instance, if we have religious commitments that aren't about our own well-being but are about serving, and we're committed to them. Those might be our agency goals, even if they're not going to help us in any direct way. But agency is a part of well-being, and thus smaller than well-being, because being an agent, being a participant, being an actively engaged actor is a part of what it means to live a well-lived life. It's not just about how much money we have, or how many toys we have, or how big our house is, or how healthy we are. Being a participant in our own lives and being able to affect change is a part of what it means to be well. In Christian theological terms, the basic approach to poverty is, I assert, quite clear. Non-voluntary poverty has the effect of violating persons' inherent human dignity, and it therefore contradicts God's good purposes for each and every human being. In the words of the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, poverty can be so debilitating that people in that condition do not even realize that they are human. I've elsewhere developed a Christian ethical account drawing on Gutierrez and the American Protestant H. Richard Niebuhr, the lesser-known brother to Reinhold Niebuhr, that emphasizes human beings as socially situated within their communities. I'd be happy to say more later about this anthropology, if you will, of the human person from Christian social ethics. But for now, let me just say that humans pursue the overlapping ends of individual well-being and social solidarity in this frame. And God intends humans to have freedom to act, to shape their world in ways that model faithfulness to God and justice in the world. H. Richard Niebuhr reminds us that we are never fully able to perceive or attain the good, so our agency is always imperfect. We can't always have the power to pursue what is good for us or for others because of human sin, in other words. Expanding human agency has to do with both increasing their individual well-being and building the social solidarity that connects people together. I'll later suggest the importance of collective agency, the problem of being able to act together for certain ends, and that this would also be compatible with this Christian understanding of social solidarity. Of course, since agency has to do with the ability to bring about all of those things that a person values, and not just a person's well-being, the issue arises of how people attribute relative value or weight to the various things that they want to pursue. I might value ice cream, and I might value watching the Red Sox game, but I might not have time to do both things at the same time, so I might have to choose between competing ends. Fortunately, the Red Sox aren't playing tonight, so you don't have to choose between this lecture and getting home in time to prepare for the game. The broad goals of solidarity and well-being must be further specified if theologians and ethicists are to engage the economists and policy experts on human development, because the latter group, the economists, want more specificity on ends that we might model or measure, and so forth. Much of the development literature assumes that people take their own well-being into account and give it some priority in their valuing of their agency goals. But here we must face an important complication, a criticism that Sen and John Elster and others aim at utilitarianism. That is, people adjust their mental states and attitudes according to what they think is possible. This has links to that insight by Gutierrez, that people who think they're non-persons, that they don't even have the ability to identify their own dignity, they might adjust down their goals to attain in life. For his part, Sen recognizes the problem of adjusting one's preferences to accept deprivation, in other words. He goes on to note the moral importance of creating social and economic conditions under which people can make genuine determinations of value, free from oppressive conditions that constrain what they, or limit what they see as possible. This point suggests that along with considerations of people's achievement of well-being their own, attention should also be paid to the social, cultural, and economic factors that lead us to shape ourselves to give too little weight to our well-being in relation to other values we might have. Thus, when speaking of agency goals in addition to well-being, it's important to try to distinguish those agency ends from the ones that are imposed by oppressive social conditions. Again, there might be a theological parallel for a theological account calling for a just society in which agents as persons in community are genuinely free to act for the good. What does all this mean? In other words, if we're not truly free, if we're coerced or oppressed in a certain way, the choices we make from among a choice set aren't truly free choices. So we need to look at the constraints around people's choices as well as the actual choices that people make. Agency is thus more than simply decision-making. It has to do with the power or capacity actually to shape one's life and that of others. It's not always possible then to simply count the number of decisions, for example, that, say, women as housewives make within the household. And some scholars have tried to measure agency in this way. They want to count how many decisions people have made. It's rather a matter of how significant those decisions are and whether they merely perpetuate unjust social roles. Naila Kabir cites an Egyptian study that finds men typically make the fundamental decision of whether or not the family will use contraception. If and when that decision is made in the affirmative, then and only then does the woman typically have the power to choose the form of contraception within that very constrained choice set. Kabir draws a distinction between efficient agency, making decisions within the given social constraints as given, and what she calls transformatory agency. Those are decisions that can change one's social or economic status in a permanent, lasting way. And only this latter form of agency in her schema can lead to poor women's empowerment. So focusing on women's roles vis-a-vis men's in differing social contexts illuminates the impact of agency on both inequality and poverty. It's well established that increasing women's agency, including through education and entrance into the formal labor market, has a significant impact on women's well-being. Sen argues that when women have the opportunity to enter the labor market, their agency increases. This can be understood in terms of an increase in relative negotiating power vis-a-vis their husbands or others within the so-called cooperative conflicts within the household. In a related but broader understanding, access to educational institutions and the labor market expands one's understanding of and ability to engage with social contexts beyond this household. It gets people out of the household to see another world that may not be quite so patriarchal. Conversely, people in situations of greater relative deprivation are more likely to adapt their attitudes and to internalize unjust conditions instead of standing up for themselves and their well-being. Women with the lowest relative status vis-a-vis their husbands and society as a whole are in the worst position to effect change. In making her distinction between effective and transformatory agency, Kabir notes the finding that women's increased agency is seen to improve, that is, reduce, excess female mortality vis-a-vis the boys' rate, while the boys' rate of mortality does not go up. This is a clear example of how an increase in transformatory agency on the part of women as a whole leads to a reduction in gender-based inequalities and also the well-being of children. Indeed, the value of local women's cooperatives and micro-lending initiatives, at least those that reshape structures, can best be cast in terms of the effect that women's increased agency has on reducing gender-based disparities and deprivation. Such programs also have a direct effect on the well-being of many people, including children. So that's an outline of poverty and agency and how the actual ability to affect change yourself as opposed to having other people act on you for relief, for instance, can make a big difference in how we understand the well-being of the poor. And I focus especially on the role of women vis-a-vis men in developing contexts because the literature is pretty strong that focusing on women's agency can have the biggest impact on positive social change. So now let me turn from this discussion, leaving from Kabir's talk of transformatory agency, or that, it's an awkward word, the notion of agency that genuinely changes structures. So I'll shift from that to the work of the leadership scholar James McGregor Burns. He's the Pulitzer Prize winner, whose influential 1978 book, Leadership, introduced the concept of transforming leadership into a variety of fields. Burns's approach to poverty reduction is rooted in this conception of transformation, in which all parties of the process of leadership raise each other up to higher levels of motivation and morality, and they achieve lasting social change. In a 2003 book, Burns turned directly to propose an initiative to combat international poverty. Now, as a prize-winning expert on the U.S. presidency and on political leadership, Burns is not offering a technical solution, but rather he's bringing to bear a moral account of transformation to the realm of global poverty. And this view has a lot to do with the agency of the poor and the powerful alike. In transforming leadership to address poverty, all affected parties must have legitimate choices to determine their own true needs. And Burns goes into a long account of needs that is multidimensional. It mirrors a lot Sen's understanding of poverty as having a whole array of dimensions to it. And I'll just skip over that for now so we could get on to the next section. But within this multidimensional account of needs for Burns, impoverished persons should not simply be recipients of assistance from paternalistic or good-intending affluent foreigners. That would make them patients. On the contrary, they are moral equals with anti-poverty workers. They must be if anti-poverty work is to be a moral enterprise. This approach builds on the understanding of transforming leadership as mutual engagement of leaders and followers in which various parties work together to understand and address this common problem. Freedom leaders, which is what he'll call these anti-poverty workers, presumably from wealthier countries, collaborate with local people to design anti-poverty strategies. It would be difficult to overstate the significance of mutuality in Burns's framework. Yet in a context of such severe socioeconomic inequalities that I've tried to identify today, and the related inequalities of power, guaranteeing the fundamental equality of human persons in these relationships, of course, is no simple task. Burns recognizes the problem of creating genuine, mutually beneficial interaction between would-be helpers from affluent societies. They could be people like us, and persons whose choices are severely debilitated by extreme poverty. Here it's important to remember that transforming leadership requires the full engagement of leaders as well as followers and the risks thereof of full engagement in that process. What specifically does Burns propose? The heart of the proposal is for a massive core of freedom leaders, presumably young adults akin to Peace Corps workers, to devote a 3-year term of their lives to serve not-for-profit agencies in the developing or two-thirds world. This would require a massive collaborative effort on the part of non-governmental and governmental organizations from both the host country and the affluent countries. Burns proposes that the program be coordinated under the United Nations auspices because the UN would provide, quote, legitimacy and credibility, unquote. That may be a little disputed in today's politics in the U.S., putting this under UN auspices. The freedom leaders themselves would presumably come from developed countries, as Burns emphasizes, but they would learn from and help train local leaders. The program would cost an estimated $100 billion a year, he says, and would require significant commitment on the part of the international community. Now, the program would turn on this mutual engagement of freedom leaders and local grassroots leaders. This proposal is just a thought experiment, really, to provoke discussion. And it focuses on the interrelated goals of increasing the agency of activists in the host country and a core of young leaders from our affluent countries. The first goal, clearly, of this type of initiative, which is modeled on many existing initiatives that are much smaller scale, is to equip local leaders to gain the capacity to transform their own lives and those of their loved ones. But at the same time, Burns's very conception of transforming leadership assumes that people from affluent countries who involve themselves would transform their own lives in positive ways. How would they do this? In 3 ways. They'd first help effect change in the lives of the poor with whom they are working. Second, they would develop their own skills and abilities on economic development, but also on self-development and self-understanding. And third, they would return to their industrialized country as spokespeople for the changes they helped realize against poverty. This, of course, might be the most important thing, that they then become spokespersons for development in their own context, which is like our context. Burns sees this transformation in terms of substantial, permanent social change that agents can effect in their work. As Sen notes, participating as agents has a number of positive effects related to development. Participating as an agent in one's own development is intrinsically valuable. It's a fundamental part of what it means to be well off. whatever other results would follow. Second, increased agency allows people to help others to meet their needs. So there's an instrumental good here. And finally, active agents are also able to clarify for themselves and would-be outsiders what people actually need. We can't assume that people know what they need or that outsiders coming in know what people need in poverty. So there's this clarification dimension to agency. Burns, though, perhaps more than Sen, and it's hard for me to criticize Sen, I must admit, emphasizes that the value of development work undertaken under these terms of mutual respect for those affluent or well-connected persons who would enroll in programs like his Freedom Leader Corps is another important part. So we're not talking just about the agency of the poor, but the agency of anti-poverty workers as well. And the agency can be increased by both parties. So now I'd like to turn to the Grammy winner, to the third piece of the puzzle for today, and that would be to look at Bono as celebrity agent of change. And I have that as a question mark in my paper. I'd like now to consider in some detail Bono's efforts to spark a movement of people in America, Britain, and Ireland to address global poverty. If anyone is well-connected and powerful in this world, Bono would seem to fit the bill. Thus, there's a certain irony and a sense of frustration when critics of his effort say that he does not have the power to make genuine change on this issue. We'll need to look, of course, at the leaders of our economic and political institutions, but I'm not ready to discount out of hand the possible agency of a global rock star on this issue. And he's been taken quite seriously. I want to talk a little bit about that in critical perspective. So the key question here is the agency of the affluent. Not just the Bono as an agent, but those of us who are would-be followers of Bono as agents as well, people who might join the One campaign or the Make Poverty History campaign as it's known in Britain and so forth. This is also the subject of a BBC made-for-television movie called The Girl in the Cafe. Some of you may have seen. HBO ran it. The whole movie is really about what agency individual citizens have, diplomats have, and our national governments of the G8 have. And the idea, trying to communicate that leaders in particular have much more agency than they perceive themselves to have. But that's the same topic I'm trying to get at here. The International Anti-Poverty Initiative, known in Britain and Ireland as Make Poverty History, and the U.S. as the One campaign, has been promoted by various celebrities, but it's been undergirded by communities of faith across the U.S. and elsewhere. These campaigns ask for no money, but only a personal commitment to stand up against poverty. And Bono's been the most visible face of this movement. In his concerts, interviews, speaking appearances, and so on, Bono has raised awareness of the most severe or extreme forms of global deprivation, and he's urged citizens and political leaders alike to commit to measures aimed at their eradication. And you may know that he was named a Time magazine Person of the Year, along with Bill and Melinda Gates in 2005 for this work that was ran under the headline The Good Samaritans, which is an interesting title. If we had more time, I'd like to talk about. Many religious and political critics have rightly expressed skepticism about an anti-poverty campaign led by celebrity activism. They tend to underestimate the grassroots and non-governmental undergirding of this movement when they do that. Some have emphasized that no matter how well-intentioned, entertainers like Bono cannot grasp and do not have the time or clout to make lasting change on these issues. After all, analysts agree the alleviation of global poverty is a matter of justice and systems, not the goodwill of even dedicated or super-rich celebrities. Fundraisers like Live Aid and Farm Aid provide a drop in the bucket compared to the resources needed to combat the ongoing nature of international deprivation. In addition, debt relief and more direct development aid can actually prop up corrupt regimes instead of helping the poor. We talked about this a little bit this afternoon in the faculty group. But are we to say then that even the super-rich celebrity leaders have no agency, or worse, they make things worse? For his part, Bono has sought to avoid the pitfalls. Through various organizational avenues, he's attempted to address the technical issues of development and to work with governments and international financial organizations to structure assistance in hard-edged ways. He formed in 2002 the organization DATA, Debt AIDS Trade Africa, to concentrate public efforts for African policy and assistance. He's met with all the major world leaders. His high-profile and somewhat surreal tour of Africa with then U.S. Secretary Paul O'Neill in 2002 helped establish Bono as more serious than other celebrities in development work. It may incidentally have contributed to Paul O'Neill's decline in being viewed as a serious financial person and his leaving the Bush administration. But that's another matter. At the G8 summit in Gleneagle, Scotland, the world's most powerful leaders committed to an additional $50 billion in annual debt relief. At least they pledged to it. And a number of them had met with Bono and credited him with some of this additional money allocated in that conference. Let me note a little bit about the Christian spirituality or faith of Bono in his work. He grew up with a Catholic father and a Protestant mother in Ireland, and he expresses a complex relationship with institutional Christianity. Bono's appealed directly and prominently to Christian faith using biblical and theological images in his songs and anti-poverty work. One of the most notable aspects of his social activism has been his ability to mobilize disparate segments of the Christian community to support the One campaign. We're talking here about Jesse Helms and Rick Warren and Michael W. Smith and a whole number, Pat Robertson, plus a lot of the religious lefties. Jim Wallace is also prominent. Sojourners has gotten on board. Bread for the World. So I don't know anybody else who's got these people to actually talk to each other. And on February 2nd of 2006, Bono addressed President Bush, various senators and others at the National Prayer Breakfast, which may be his most complete theological defense of his work. He drew on biblical language like Jubilee, the Beatitudes, and the Good News for the Poor, arguing that global justice requires the firm commitment of the U.S. government and other affluent nations to make a significant shift in national priorities. He called specifically for a 1% increase in the federal budget from the less than 1% presently dedicated to foreign assistance. He called it a national tithe and framed it not as charity, but as a move for justice that would also further U.S. national security interest. He also criticizes the Christian religious community for not exercising its agency. In a press conference, he stated, "There are 2,103 verses of Scripture pertaining to the poor. Jesus Christ only speaks of judgment once." I'm not sure how he's counting, but it's not all about the things that the church bangs on about. It is not about sexual immorality. It's not about megalomania or vanity. It is about the poor. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you let me in. This is at the heart of the gospel. Why is it that we have seemed to have forgotten this? Why isn't the church leading this movement? I'm here tonight because the church ought to be ready to do that. In overall terms, celebrities and other leaders seeking to effect social change face various tasks of communicating information about the present reality, the descriptive task. Second, articulating a moral argument for change. And third, cultivating motivation to act for that change. So I want to review Bono's efforts in those three terms. First, although the basic statistics on global poverty are available for those who seek them out, Bono is able to communicate them with his audiences who might not otherwise receive information about poverty. Bono is a musician who's been an international celebrity for over 2 decades now. He now has a following across a broad swath of age groups, from current-day teenagers to the baby boomers. Yet Bono would argue, along with many others in the faith community, that the descriptive information only gains its significance from a normative theological understanding of human well-being. So this is the second step. Running throughout Bono's interviews, comments during U2 concerts, and his song lyrics is a fundamental moral commitment to the equality of human persons. Indeed, in nearly every case in which he mentions equality, he grounds his moral claim in the equality of all persons before God, created in God's image. His moral argument moves from the status of equality to the expansion of our scope of who the neighbor is. Rather than strictly opposing national favoritism in the way, say, the philosopher Peter Singer has done, Bono attempts to reappropriate national values to make them truly global. As one notable example, during U2's 2005 Vertigo World Tour, Bono built upon the imagery of his song From Pride in the Name of Love about the American dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to extend the dream to those in extreme poverty around the world. And I'll quote here Bono. "Sing for Dr. King's dream, for a dream big enough to fit the whole world, a dream where everyone is created equal under the eyes of God. Everyone, everyone. Not just an American dream or an Asian dream or a European dream, also an African dream. Also an African dream. Africa, from the bridge at Selma in Mississippi to the mouth of the River Nile, from the swamplands of Louisiana to the high peaks of Kilimanjaro, from Dr. King's America to Nelson Mandela's Africa. A journey of equality moves on, 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 on." So seen as a whole, Bono's is embracing a strategy of promoting obligations to the least of these around the world while expanding rather than opposing U.S. national values. Such a strategy is not unlike Dr. King's own appropriation of both Christian and American ideals in the struggle for justice. And he's self-reflective about the role of storytelling in musical performance as well as in motivating followers for social change. In an address to a World Bank audience, Bono stated, "What do rock stars like me have to contribute to debates about global poverty, the international debt burden on developing countries, and HIV/AIDS? I think we can help tell the story better. We can help, for instance, in the area of branding, because rock stars have, above all, the ability to build their own brands. We need to get much better at branding in the area of poverty. We have to dramatize the story. We have to shape a clear melody line, or the public will fall asleep in the comfort of their freedom, as I indeed did for many years." He goes on to assert that the church hasn't done its part in this telling of the story. Expanding our agency is related to developing our moral imagination in this way, to understand that we can envision and then enact a reality different from the present one. So Bono has repeatedly invoked the story of the Good Samaritan in this effort to move from moral justification to moral motivation. And he's done so in four ways. First, he emphasizes, not unlike Peter Singer and others, and some theologians, that the concept of neighbor applies globally in today's interconnected world. In this frame, we're all neighbors in the global village. He states, "If you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, when it comes to Africa, we're not just crossing the road to avoid the man who needs help. We're catching a bus in the other direction." Second, he criticizes religious inaction, people who express a religious identity but who do not live out that faith in practices of justice and compassion. In his word, "We must wake up the sleeping giant of the church. We must set alarm clocks to rouse our politicians who also slumber. The choice is there before each and every one of us, to stop and tend to the distant pilgrim sick on the side of the road, or a nervous glance, and we turn away from the pilgrim, away from God's grace." Third, and on a related note, Bono is even more critical of religious hypocrisy. The U2 song "Crumbs from Your Table," written by Bono, replete with biblical images, is a stinging attack on American Christians, we are told, who parade their religiosity but don't live that faith out. "You speak of signs and wonders. I need something other. I would believe if I was able, but I'm waiting on the crumbs from your table." Fourth and finally, this is an interesting part for a diverse audience. Bono suggests that the people who will respond, like the Samaritan, might not be churchgoers or the pietistic leaders in the world. Although Bono's more subtle in developing this point, he emphasizes in various settings that the coalitions he builds come from left and right, from churches and casinos. He clearly relishes the fact that he sees God's work taking place in acts of charity and justice far beyond the institutional church. And I'd suggest that he sees himself in this latter group of non-churchgoers who are doing the work of the Good Samaritan. Bono understands himself as a storyteller who draws upon his talents and social position to address social ills, especially absolute poverty. He seeks to move his listeners, his followers, from understanding the descriptive reality and moral badness of global poverty to engaging willfully as agents in an effective response. This requires telling the story that alleviating the worst of poverty is within our reach, that it's desirable, even cool to do, and that we will be proud that we did so. But, for a little critique, do Bono's fans become genuine agents? It's not clear that the people who respond to Bono by signing on to the One campaign or in another way actually do see the poor as people like themselves. Perhaps they just want to be seen as in the movement with Bono. In a sense, they want to be his neighbor. Surely the education piece of the campaign needs to move to the next step so that all will learn, be trained to care about poverty through an educational mission. In other words, even if the motives of his followers are not the intended ones, the campaign can habituate members, in any case, to cultivate their own commitment against poverty. And members of Bono's staff at Data, with whom I have spoken, have insisted that the various campaign members are agents who act in response to email alerts, to pressures, to send to politicians when that is needed. They claim they can turn 100,000 or 200,000 messages out to Congress with one email alert that they send to their members. Then you might say, well, is hitting send or reply on an email a real active agency or not? And that's another question for today's world. Bono claims that his goal, albeit large, does not require a wholesale refutation of Western consumerism. In the grand scheme of things, the relative amount of money needed is small to address global poverty. Jeff Sachs has hit this note. The Human Development Reports and the UNDP have hit this note. The amount needed is in the range of $200 billion a year or some such. And this is small change in the global economy, I guess. So they have to, Bono is trying to say we don't need to change our Western consumerism all that much to affect change. Well, that's an interesting question. And it sets limits on what kind of activism Bono can do as a rock star who lives a Western consumeristic lifestyle himself. What is required is a large block of citizens willing to express a moral and political commitment to end extreme poverty. During U2's sold-out concert tour across the continents, Bono declared nightly that the One campaign, now claiming some 5 million members in the U.S., has surpassed the membership of the National Rifle Association. Something. This comparison is, so to speak, on target. The One campaign's goal... Sorry, I couldn't have... I want to make sure you're all listening. The One campaign's goal is to communicate to political leaders that there is a large block of citizens out there who do care about global poverty and who do vote. And indeed, given our current political climate, even politicians who want to fight poverty need this public pressure so that they can claim it is in their own interest so to act. Bono made me do it, they can say. Bono could cite a quote here where he says that's exactly what we want. Some politicians are interested and anxious to do something. We must enable to do them to do it through our pressure. This issue of political transformation remains a critical point for evaluating Bono's public leadership. It appears he's pushed this category of celebrity leadership about as far as he can, more carefully than most have done, to talk about structural, justice-based transformation. Whether the voluntary motivation of citizens has sufficient agency to pressure their political leaders, this remains to be seen. So, by way of conclusion, I want to state first simply that an agenda for addressing global poverty should focus on developing and harnessing the agency of what I have called the poor and the powerful alike. I've tried to start with the agency of the poor and discuss why that's an important part of seeing of development, of seeing impoverished persons not as patients but as agents. And I cited some of the literature that helps us to think about that, to see that that actually makes a difference. Then I looked at James McGregor Burns and this discussion of agency of both the poor and the anti-poverty workers who would cross global lines through the Freedom Leaders program that he proposes. And then I looked at Bono to look at the agency of the well-off or the affluent or the powerful. People who might be his followers can afford to go to his concerts or buy his CDs or listen to them on the radio, and who might act through the one campaign or in related ways. So that's the basic point of the paper, is that we need to talk about the agency of both groups and the distribution in between of powerful and the economically powerful and the economically deprived, and addressing global poverty requires thinking about both and their coordination. I've tried to suggest that few, if any, of those actors, the rich or the poor or those in between, hold sufficient agency for that effort, at least alone. Amartya Sen and his colleagues working to develop the capability approach have helped us to shift our thinking of poverty from the simple lack of income or basic goods to the lack of capability to function well in the multiple dimensions of their society. I got lost here. Thomas Friedman and others have optimistically told us that the world is becoming flat. But even if that were true, agents who are currently capability poor would have to have the skills and capacities to compete even on that level playing field. Studies show that increasing the control, the options, the social exposure of marginalized persons, and not just providing them with income supports as if they were patients, is a successful path out of poverty. Burns's moral account, an imaginative call for freedom leaders, helps us to bring the agency of the well-off into the picture as well. There are other interesting programs to link the agency of would-be donors to that of the global poor, including connecting micro-lenders over the Internet to recipients of their loans. This is a hot idea these days, of connecting micro-lenders in this country to development programs and poor persons with micro-lending needs in the developing world. But it seems clear that the genuinely mutual transformations are needed to achieve this, what Burns calls transforming leadership. And the question is, can you do that over the Internet? Or do you need face-to-face contact? Bono's celebrity activism merits our attention, as the one campaign alone claims millions of members. Faith-based organizations like the original One Campaign Coalition member Bread for the World have been galvanized in their own anti-poverty work by some of this celebrity activism. It's clear that Bono is a presence in the halls of power, but it's not yet clear the degree of success that his movement has had on affecting lasting political change. Bono's interesting work has also placed the question of Christian faith and poverty at center stage. Juxtaposing his own rock star lifestyle with an Italian sports car, multiple homes, and a reported expensive taste in wine, with global poverty starkly poses the question of our consumer comforts and whether they're compatible with the gospel. That's a topic for another day, though in this context it does behoove us to wonder to what extent our attachment to our lifestyle keeps us from exercising the considerable agency that we could have in fighting poverty. And it's a reminder that the impoverished themselves don't have this luxury of reflecting on their material excess. The analysis also points in an additional direction. If individuals like Bono can be accused of not having sufficient agency, we should develop and must develop our notion of collective agency. To what extent in our institutionalized, depersonalized, bureaucratized global society do we need to think past the individual agency level and think about the agency of our institutions that we equip? And then if we do that, to what extent is this dehumanizing by taking agency in this global, vast world away from individual persons? Is this solidarity for the global age, or do we still need some individual commitment within those institutions? This direction would allow us to bring in the theological discussions of structural sin, as Gutierrez puts it, and both Niebuhr brothers also highlight in their work. If we're going to talk about collective agency, then we also need to talk about collective sin and the imperfect efforts whenever we get institutions involved, as well as individuals who are also, of course, not perfect. I want to end on a related theological note about agency, human and divine. The emphasis here has been on human agency, how various parties can express their own capacity to affect change in light of the face of global poverty. But it's fitting to acknowledge expressly that Christian faith also entails the understanding of God as acting in the present order, including the economy in ways both known and unknown to us. As H. Richard Niebuhr puts it, God is acting through us and despite us. The theological conviction that God is acting indeed as sovereign over all of creation should not be employed as an excuse for human inaction or for irresponsible or narrowly self-interested action. It is, however, a reminder that we should embrace the moral task without believing that we are going to fix the world on our own. Thank you. Okay.
Well, what do you think? Questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Sure. Thank you.
I want to ask you two questions about your strategy. The paper today, but more broadly, could address Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, non-religious people. There is no reference to religions outside of Christianity, constructive references, which omission suggests the possibility of lurking behind this a kind of triumphant Christianity. I'm wondering about, in this topic of religion and issues of polity, what your strategy is in emphasizing exclusively to a mixed audience Christian belief. The second question is, would I be correct in thinking that everything you said about agency could be said by a person who did not share yours or Niebuhr's or other people's theological views, and that part of your paper really addresses the church, Christian church, and addresses a Christian audience. But one could say what you want to say about agency with no religious reference at all.
Thank you very much for those questions. And the issue of audience for me is a difficult one, and to think about how to frame this paper and to offer something from where I come was the important thing that I thought about here. And also, in terms of using the Christian references in this paper, I was following, to some extent, Bono's lead on how he draws on his own Christian faith in this piece. But the book I just completed writing and will be in bookstores next December is on religiously diverse America and how we can achieve public leadership on important social ends, drawing people in from various perspectives: humanist, Aristotelian, atheist, Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and so on. And most of us are probably some combination of those categories. And in that work, I don't draw on Christian theology because I'm trying to reach a broad, diverse audience. For this particular talk, because of the divinity school here and so on, I wanted to give a taste of the work I have done, constructive work I have done in Christian social ethics, and I believe that there is a rich set of traditions that we can draw on to address global poverty and its problems in the world, in Africa and Latin America and Asia and so on. But I do believe that we can talk about agency across any number of traditions, and I should state here in this context that Amartya Sen, for one, is not a person of faith in any direct sense. He would call himself an atheist, but he's very conversant and respectful towards people from a number of traditions: Buddhist, Hindu, Christian. Has talked to a number of scholars in constructive work, including myself, from those traditions. So I do think you can develop an account of agency from those various traditions, and I'm interested in doing that with other persons as well.
Could I follow up one short question?
Please.
Am I right in concluding then that if I were Jewish and here today, I need not hear this as excluding?
I hope you would.
Tradition.
No, I hope you would read it.
Never called on. Or never referred to.
Right. I hope you would read it as an invitation, and I'll read your comments as a invitation to make that more clear at the front end, that where I'm socially located and how I believe there are a lot of resources from traditions I draw from, but that it's an inclusive conversation. Thanks.
Steve back here had a question.
In Bono's opinion, or in yours, would the recipient would the poor have any responsibilities or obligations, and if so, what would they be?
Bono's work through data does look at issues of agency through very local programs in Africa and elsewhere. But I focused on his work on the One campaign, Making Poverty History, the Millennium Campaign out of the UN organization. Today is Stand Up for Poverty Day, it turns out. They're trying to get 25 million people to stand up for poverty around the world. Those are mostly aimed at the agency of the poor and of the affluent or the powerful or the influential in society. But I certainly think, I've heard Bono speak enough about the development programs he would support, the anti-corruption efforts he would support, the local initiatives he has supported throughout Africa in particular, to know that he does have this agent view. He might not quite use the philosophical language of agent and patient, but it would emphasize that as well. But I used him here to really emphasize the agency of folks in this room.
Get out front here and afterwards, James.
I'm wondering if you had a strategy for saving the Christian United or bringing them into the fold of this mission.
That's an easy one. No. I think that the effort against global poverty, global extreme poverty, transcends political category. And I think there are well-meaning people on the right, left, and center who want to get involved in this. And I think it, unlike some other hot-button issues like homosexuality, abortion, there is a possible coalition here that can be built. And Bono, I actually saw him. Maybe I should admit this. I went to see him in Charlotte. I called it field research.
Who paid for the ticket?
I did. I didn't charge it to the department or anything. But I could have, right? Yeah. Jesse Helms was in the building. Jesse Helms, that's right. They did. He called him Brother Jesse Helms, and he said, Jesse Helms has helped us with the anti-AIDS legislation for Africa. And he wanted to lift that up. Now, I didn't see Jesse Helms in the building. The thought that he was in the Charlotte Coliseum to hear U2 play is still pretty funny to me. But he's worked with President Bush and caught a lot of criticism for doing that. And Bono's, I think he actually has been a little bit unfocused in the last year or two on endorsing a number of different campaigns. But for a while he was really focused on this global poverty, to say that he would work with anyone if they would work with him on this issue. Now, does that mean that I think the Millennium Challenge accounts or what's actually happened in Washington in terms of aid to Africa has been helpful or as successful as it should be? I don't think so. And I think there's an over-dependence on market solutions and so on the right. But I do think the Christian right is coming to the table on this, or can come to the table on this. So I hope that's good enough for your question.
Okay, Dan, next.
I really appreciate what you're trying to do, and I do think that the Christian social ethics can play a very strong inspirational role, especially probably for mainline Protestant denominations that may have been politically inert in recent years to kind of come back in and pursue progressive causes and kind of redefine the role of religion in American politics away from the way it has been defined for the last decade or 2 decades, I would say. So I applaud your efforts there. I think your analysis scores really high on the role of religion as inspiration and motivation and individual agency. The vast corpus of sociological research on social movements over the last century says that individual agency, it has to be a given, and that there are all kinds of other forces that have to come into play, resources that come into play in order for real social transformations of the structural kind that you alluded to actually occur. When I think of the United States as a case, I think the major social changes that occurred were in the 30s and the New Deal, which was a major redistributive effort, and then again the Great Society. Those followed on the heels of major social movements which had clearly articulated goals that were legislative in nature and took a lot of organizing and analysis of the roots of poverty. So what I would like to know is how can Christian social ethics perspective be expanded, or at least beyond the topic that you addressed today, or have you done so, to address from a Christian social ethics perspective, how does one analyze the roots of poverty, and then how does one fashion a collective effort with certain collective goals, especially legislative in nature? Because most of the transformations that have occurred worldwide are either statist, mixed economy, or syndicalist, grassrootsy microenterprise or cooperatives or kibbutz or whatever. Okay, so how does a Christian ethics perspective inform, one, the analysis of the roots of poverty, and two, the strategy, the collective strategy for really making meaningful change?
Yeah. Well, that's another small question. There were even two small questions in there. First, and I don't mean to discount the question in any way, but I would say first, the Christian social ethical perspective should not try to do social policy on its own. People working in ethics like myself need to be in conversation with economists and public policymakers. And I think of Becky Blank, even if she weren't here, I would invoke her now as a person who's done this hard work on the front lines of policy and understand issues, but also understand where communities of faith are coming from. I think some Christian social ethics or theology could parade as bad social policy ideas. I really mean that. I think we need to not, and I don't want to step too much out of my ethical frame to pretend to be a policymaker. That being said, I think the capability approach gives us a vocabulary and a set of ideas to think about what individuals can do, what the not-for-profit sector and religious communities can do, and also some ideas about the kind of empowering initiatives that states can do. So, Sen and others have done work to show that the most successful development is a mix of a strong private sector and strong social public institutions that are more than a safety net. They're enabling. They're dealing with positive freedoms to make people better participants, to prepare them to be participants in their society. So it's got to be some mix. It's definitely, in my account, it would be a positive role for the market. A number of my friends and colleagues in the Society of Christian Ethics or on the Journal of Religious Ethics who write there from various traditions, in fact, are radical in the sense of discounting the market as a part of the solution. And then I have friends who write more from the Christian conservative position who I sometimes say want to baptize the market as God's way. And I don't think it's either. I think it's a critical view for the market, and then nobody's advocating for no state. The question is, what positive role can the state play in social policy?
Is that a Christian social ethical perspective that the state has to intervene in the market?
Yes. And I would cite yesterday's lecture that in the even though I didn't hear it yesterday, I heard it we've been in conversation with Dr. Blankenheim. Yes, I think in our bureaucratized, institutionalized, complex economy and society, we can't think of Christian social ethical response at the individual or even voluntary association level. It has to go partly through public policy.
Well, speaking of Becky, you had a question.
So I'm going to follow up directly on that one. Doug, this was a great talk, but I'm going to ask you about government as well, right? So it's hard to listen to this conversation and not, think back 40 years where we had an extended discussion in this country about agency among the poor, which is called empowerment, right? War on poverty. Yeah. And indeed, we enacted a variety of programs directly designed, very explicit discussion to empower the poor, gave funding to low-income communities with the idea that they would decide how this was most effectively used, that, all of the issues that you're talking about. This, of course, was viewed as a very great threat by local governments and to a lesser extent by state governments as well. And most of those programs got shut down very, very fast because the governments essentially could not tolerate sort of this outside their control activities taking place that were in some ways very directly threatening and at worst directly confrontational against what was going on in local government. So to tie back to your talk, these individual leadership, whether it's celebrity leaders or the James McGregor Burns idea of let's send millions of teenagers out around the world. These,
or college
college. They young people. As we get older, they have this threat of being in opposition, and obviously are to a certain extent because they're trying to change the way things are local government and can very quickly fail if there's no direct institutions around them that want to help, and in fact, if the local institutions around them want to do everything possible to facilitate their failure, you get in trouble. And that's where sort of this whole discussion of individual leadership leaves me feeling like, you really got to do more to embed this in institutions and give the incentives in institutions to make this happen, or you're setting yourself up for failure.
Thanks for that comment. And this paper, in isolation, did focus on individual persons and religious communities, and so in these non-governmental kind of programs. But I don't think all my work focused on that. And I just would take that as an important contextualization of the effort. And I was trying to point that direction, and the next paper should probably be on collective agency and what the state institutions would have to do with that. I guess I would say Steve brought this up a little bit in our afternoon faculty session today. It's true that some governments would see this capability talk and empowering their people as somehow a threat. I think that's it's unfortunate, and it's also realist. It's realistic to think that way. I think the capability approach and the focus on agency that I try to develop could also apply to government policies and thinking about what government should properly do. But to develop that requires hard-edged policy thinking and people being smart about federalism. Well, which programs could we devolve? We talk about subsidiarity now, and devolve from the Catholic tradition. Actually, what programs can we devolve to the local governments without giving them unfunded mandates to do so? Those are very practical questions, but I don't think they're inconsistent with this approach. I was going to say that the war on poverty didn't work, and I was going to reply with it, but it worked for the elderly. But that's not what he wants. I'll just leave that.
Go ahead. Take it.
I'd be interested in any thoughts you may have on the consequences of succeeding in this arena. If we were to make poverty history, so to speak, are there downstream consequences, social, economic, moral, of a world in which 6 billion people are doing well?
Well, the best consequences would be that more people would have higher well-being. But are you thinking about, well, let me just think through this with you. Well, there would be more people who would have access to markets to buy stuff that might pollute our planet, for instance. Is that the kind of thing you're going to?
It's that kind of thing. Actually, it was triggered somewhat by the comment about minimum wage and the fact that it's argued in too simplistic a way, and was thinking of all of the many consequences of succeeding in this arena. And so, I mean, I don't know where it goes, but it's sort of interesting to think about what if we were to succeed.
Yeah. Well, on the positive side, you would have a positive side in terms of the way economists see the world. You'd have more people able to participate in the market and participate in their societies for positive ends. On the negative side, the first thing I thought of was the possible negative consequences for environmental effects of people using more products and more electricity and so on. We'd have to think about it. And it wouldn't happen at 6 billion. We're already above that. So if we were ever to solve poverty, and I think that's the T-loss, but we might never, I'm tempted to say the poor we'll always have with us. But it would happen at 8 billion, or not, it's an even bigger number than 6. But I'd welcome other thought on that as well.
I just want to, I'm not just being cute about the question. I'm on the board of a microcredit organization, and some of the consequences of marketizing a small village are, the line doesn't always go up and to the right.
It's a good, I want to think more about that. That's a great question.
We actually have a question right over here and then over there.
It's been my understanding that individual efforts in certain African countries like Kenya are being more successful than any government or institutional effort to help the poor. And I can cite examples of this. There's been a lot of
it's not an either or. That I think that the anti-corruption efforts need to happen in state organizations and in the non-governmental ones. Is what I'm trying to say. And more accountability and transparency is always a good thing, or at least in this context, I believe that's right. But I would want, I think the economists would generally say that there has been progress, at least in lowering the percentage of people in poverty below the $2 line or the $1 extreme line. So there are things that are working. The question is to look specifically at those as opposed to looking at entire continents or entire countries.
We have one more question, and you're in.
Hope it's a good one.
I hope so too. I'm thinking about this concept of agency, and through your talk, it seemed like you were saying that agency is a good thing, and that to be acted upon is a bad thing, or to increase agency on the part, particularly of people who don't experience a lot of power to transform their own situations and so on. But I'm wondering about how to understand then ourselves as agents in a context where we're also always being affected by other people, and the importance in this transformative moment of thinking about the positive ways in which we need to stay open as agents to impacts from government agencies, positive. And how to make that distinction. I think it complicates the issue of agency quite a bit if you think about the give and take of being an agent.
Thank you. I like the way you put that as well. We're not in control. So much is happening around us that affects us. And one of the motivations for writing this paper was that I work on inequality and poverty issues, and I often feel at a loss that the issues are so big. And then I look around, I thought about this Bono campaign, I thought about conversations with Jim Burns about his transforming leadership. I realized there are a lot of people who feel like they're always being acted upon, and we're the ones who are we're the ones with the power and the capacity to act in this economy and this society. And we could think theologically or morally about not being in control. We all die. Things happen that we can't control. And that the well-being, I would say, is the ability to roll with the punches as well. And if you hold on too tight, often we're not achieving our own well-being. So I think that goes a little bit to your point about being able also to have others act on us and for us not to go crazy about that.
Or to be able to make a distinction between the positive contributions of others in our lives and when we are being oppressed by the power that others are exerting.
And in my book on inequality and Christian ethics, I have a section where I distinguish inequalities based on power differentials from genuine differences. So what's the difference between inequalities, which we tend to think of as bad? They're not always bad. Certain kinds are, certain kinds aren't. From differences, which tend to be positively seen in our world. We talk about differences as a good, learning from the other, and so on. And it's a good thing we're not all the same. Those kind of things. And I came out trying to say, well, we need a basic playing field of equality or mutuality on which we all can then have the capacity to pursue those differences. So genuine differences only happen when it's not marginalization. So thanks for that question too.
Now I've been promised that we have one final question that's tremendously good. Please.
Wow.
Do you have to feel guilty to be part of this global strategy? That's number one. Number two is how do you seek to gain trust of target populations? And the third one is how do you seek to overcome the problem of perception from the target population, especially outsiders coming, has been characterized as a flying plane. It never lands. You see it and then it goes away. So those three.
So which one of those was the last
in terms
one?
of build
All three were.
trust and commitment.
I don't think guilt is a part of it. I know a lot of people are motivated by guilt too because they see poverty and they're not poor, and so. But I don't think that needs to be any part of the motivation, and it can be unhealthy. Feeling the understanding the plight of another through the moral imagination zone, I think, is a related but positive way to approach that as well.
Well, it gives you, it gives you a sense of satisfaction that you are generous or something.
Oh, well, that's another. I've tried to work on that as well, and I'm not going to try to do it here, but the question of where we are relative to others as a part of our own well-being, and how some of that can be bad and not healthy. And you need a moral framework to talk about this, but you can, if you're on the lower end, one of the bad parts can be envy, and if you're on the upper end, it can be just feeling good because you're above these other people. But also, but we are social beings, and we do see if everyone else in this room has an iPod and they're listening to something important on the iPod, and we don't have one, it's a different sense. In a real sense, you're deprived of some communal experience, a human experience. That's probably a bad example because iPods tend to isolate people. But you understand what I mean. So there are senses of being a member of a community where some social goods are necessary, and that's a healthy part of a well-lived life. Smith said that in his day, a day laborer needed a linen shirt to appear in public without shame. And I think that was a healthy sense of being in relation with others, and you needed something to appear in public without shame. The terms about relating to others and not being perceived as a drive-by helper or something like that, a disrespectful, condescending, paternalistic helper. I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, it's a fundamental question. I try to get at by just naming how difficult this mutuality that Burns perceives to achieve. I'm the director of the Center for Civic Engagement at the University of Richmond, and we're a wealthy school like Vanderbilt, and a private school, University of the City. We're changing models of relating with the poor in our local area. We're not doing paint and run anymore. We're not doing drive-by service. We are building relationships with one north side neighborhood called Highland Park, and have been involved for 3 years now. Not because we're helpers, but because we think we can learn from them, and we're being more clear that you're teaching our students even as we're trying to help with this social service or that. But that's about relationship building, and it's on a case-by-case kind of thing. But the moral goal is mutual respect based on equality, I believe. Thank you.
Okay, for the last word, I'd like to invite my colleague Doug Meeks to stand up and put in the last word. He didn't know it, so he didn't prepare it.
The last word is thank you very much for being here, and will you join me in thanking Doug Hicks?